Okay. Now, in our lesson today, across the continent, we're going to start learning how to take notes a certain way. In your workbook, we're going to be working on across the continent, but I want you to understand our progression here. Uh, Eventually, I'd like us to get to these double entry notes, and in class, I'll go over it in much more detail, but I want to give you an idea here of how this is all going to play together. So today, we're going to be focusing on the main idea, and then tomorrow, we're going to be doing main idea and supporting details, and then we're going to be reflecting, okay, on what we're reading. And then finally, we're going to put it all together where we're going to put passage and page, the main idea and details, and then our reflection. So we're going to go over each thing slowly, one by one. And today, basically, we're just going to identify the main idea. What is the main idea of the passage? The opening paragraph, long walk, and then hot, cold, wet, dry. And we can see that here. The text breaks it up very nicely. We have the opening paragraph here, then we have the long walk, and then we have the whole hot, cold, wet, dry, breaking it down into the three paragraphs. So let's take a look at the opening paragraph. We see, what do you think of when you hear the words American Indians? Do you think of teepees, bows and arrows? Do you picture feather headdresses and canoes? The truth is, America's first people were and still are very diverse groups with hundreds of different ways of living and speaking. So now let's take a look at our worksheet here, which is reproducible number 32. See, I don't have the page here on my book, but we're going to try to identify what the main idea is. So let's take a look at it. Now, this is, our first attempt. So what you put down here, when you look at this, what is your thought? What is this paragraph trying to tell you? And is it right there, or do we have to think about it? Well, they're asking a lot of questions. So, they're really asking us what we think. And then they give an answer here. So you could say right here, when they're giving us the answer, that America's first people were very diverse. Okay, and that could be the main idea here. Okay, you could uh, think of something else, maybe a little bit better. This is totally up to you. Really, just an exercise to start thinking about what these main ideas are. Now, I'm not going to go into what the answers are, so you could just write them down. This one, I think you can. You can write American Indians are very diverse in culture and language and so on. And you could put it, it's right there. They say the answer. They give us the answer right there. Most of our answers are going to be right there. But a think and search would be, maybe you have some prior knowledge. Oh, I remember my teacher in third grade said such and such. Then you could say it's a think and search. But most of the time it's going to be right there. I mean, we need to get our main idea from the reading. So most of the time we're going to have a right there. Okay. Now, when we get into the material here, American Indians, one thing that I remember growing up is that anytime that people ran into Indians, they would have feather headdresses. They would say how and have teepees and totem poles and shoot bows and arrows and so on like that. Very stereotypical. But what we'll find is that each one of the tribes that we are studying here, we're going to look at the Inuit, the Kwakiutl, Lakota, the Pueblo, the Iroquois, they all seem to have something uh, of a stereotype. For instance, the Kwakiutls were the ones with the totem poles. The Lakota were the ones with the teepees. But you don't see teepees in Kwakiutl or with the Pueblo. You just wouldn't see any teepees there. They live very differently, very diverse, depending on the geography that they lived in. Um, some of them had massive resources in one area, but very deficient in others. So, for instance, eastern woodlands, you could see a lot of things are made out of wood. You don't have a lot of wood in the Southwest, so they made their houses differently. Um, the Lakota had teepees for a specific reason that we'll go into. So, all these different stereotypes that we see, they kind of cherry picked, a little bit from here. You got the canoes, you got the teepees, you got the totem poles. So, but the Indians were very diverse. They had different ways of doing things, different ways of living, different ways of speaking, very different cultures. So right off the bat, we need to get out of our mind that the American Indians were just one nation, one group of people. There was many, many nations all over, not only North America, but South America as well. They thought of things very, very differently um, from each other. Just like if you go to the other side of America, you go to California, they're going to talk and speak differently. Even though we speak the same language, uh, it is a very different culture in other states. So why would we think that the Indians would be any different than what we are? We go to Mexico, they have a totally different language. But the Indians were even more diverse because every single tribe, every single region had a different language. Okay, there was no dominant culture over everything. All right, so let's get to the long walk. And what the long walk is talking about here is something that we touched up yesterday of how the Indians got here. We know from Cactus Hill that they were here at least 18,000 years ago. Um, Scientists don't know exactly how they got here. Many Americans believe that they've always been here. And the scientists look at the map and see this, well, first of all, they look at American Indians and they recognize that their faces look oddly familiar to Asians, to people that live in Asia. And so they made a connection. Well, they must have come from Asia. And take a look here. Asia is very close to Alaska. Maybe during the Ice Age, they walked across and started moving down and populating the two Americas. And so, there are many scientists that subscribe to that, but there's really no proof either way. We really don't know um, how the American Indians got here, whether they were always here or whether they came from another place. So that's something to keep in mind as we go forward. We don't know a lot about their history that far back. And that 18,000 years ago, so that's a long time ago to try to track exactly what happened. It's very difficult anywhere in the world, let alone in an area where they don't have written language for a very long time. Okay, and then we get to hot, cold, wet, dry. Every region is different and they speak different languages. Their challenges are different. So, for instance, when we look at the Inuit live all the way up here in Alaska and all along very northern areas, very cold. I can't imagine living in such a cold area now with our technology, but especially back then, it took quite a bit of hardiness and technique to survive in such a harsh environment. But the Inuit lived all the way up here and survived by using the techniques that they discovered. And then we have the Kwakiutl, who live right up here in the Pacific Northwest, and they had a very different, probably the opposite of the Inuit. They had lots of resources, natural resources, very nice area, and they were able to have an abundance of food. But it rained a lot, so they had to deal with the rain. The opposite of raining a lot is down here in the Pueblo area. They lived in the American Southwest, very dry region, so they had to figure out how to stay cool rather than the Inuit having to stay warm. And they did not have quite as much food as the Kwakiutl up here, so they had to figure out how to make the best of whatever they did have. And then we've got the Lakota. Lakota is probably one of the more familiar ones that we think of. Them and the Iroquois are the two that really resonate with our image of what American Indians are like. Lakota lived out in the Great Plains. Not a lot of trees, not a lot of resources to build houses. And their main source was buffalo. So they'd follow them around, and they needed portable shelters, so they made teepees. And they would drag these things around all along the Great Plains trying to find the buffalo and then eating them and using them for pretty much everything, all their capital resources. And then we have the Iroquois over here in the eastern woodlands. And they, obviously, when you have woodlands, you're going to make a lot of things out of wood. So their cultures, their ways of life are going to vary greatly based on where they live. Um, what kind of resources? The buffalo for Lakota, they're going to rely on buffalo. They have lots of wood here in the eastern woodlands, so they're going to make pretty much everything out of wood. Um, in Alaska, there's a lot of snow and ice. They're going to have to rely on the animals up there to figure out how to survive. Kwakiutl have it very easy in the Pacific Northwest. Pueblo don't quite have it as easy, but they have a lot of special resources like clay, and they make their houses out of adobe clay bricks. So they really use what's around them to to survive and then thrive.